The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy's pristine courtyard as Admiral William Harrison adjusted his dress whites one final time. Today marked his 20th anniversary as the Academy's commandant, and the celebration would include a special ceremony honoring distinguished alumni. At 62, Harrison carried himself with the bearing of a man who had never questioned his place in the world's most powerful navy. His chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons, each one earned through decades of administrative excellence and political maneuvering rather than combat experience. Harrison had built his career on the foundation of modern naval warfare theory, advanced logistics, and strategic planning. He was proud of his contributions to naval efficiency and his role in modernizing the fleet's operations. However, there was one aspect of naval history that always made him uncomfortable: the romanticized stories of old-school combat veterans. He believed such tales were often exaggerated, relics of a bygone era that had little relevance to today's technology-driven military. As he walked toward the assembly hall, Harrison's aide, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, briefed him on the day's schedule. Among the honored guests was a man named Thomas "Tom" Garrett, a 78-year-old veteran who had served during the Vietnam War. According to the brief, Garrett had been a naval aviator and had requested to share some remarks about his service experience. "What's his background?" Harrison asked, skimming through the guest list. "He flew reconnaissance missions during Vietnam, sir." Apparently earned several commendations, but the records are somewhat incomplete. "He's been living quietly in a small town in Montana for the past 40 years, Mitchell replied. Harrison nodded absently. Another old-timer with war stories, he thought. These veterans always seem to appear at such events, eager to relive their glory days with embellished tales of heroism. While Harrison respected their service, he had grown tired of listening to what he perceived as outdated accounts that bore little resemblance to modern military reality. The ceremony began with the usual pomp and circumstance. Harrison delivered his opening remarks about the Navy's bright future, emphasizing technological advancement and strategic innovation. He spoke passionately about drone warfare, satellite guidance systems, and the importance of cyber warfare in modern naval operations. The audience, consisting of current students, faculty, and alumni, listened attentively to his vision of 21st-century naval supremacy. When it came time for the veteran presentations, several distinguished guests shared brief remarks about their service. Each story followed a predictable pattern that Harrison had heard countless times before: challenging missions, close calls, and the brotherhood of military service. The Admiral found himself checking his watch, eager to move on to the reception where he could discuss more pressing matters with potential benefactors and political allies. Then, Tom Garrett was introduced. The elderly man walked slowly to the podium, his back straight despite his age. He wore a simple suit with a small American flag pin on his lapel. There were no flashy military decorations, no attention-seeking accessories. Garrett appeared to be exactly what Harrison expected: another aging veteran trying to recapture past glory. "Thank you for having me here today," Garrett began in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly throughout the large hall. "I know many of you are eager to hear about modern naval capabilities, and rightfully so. Today's Navy is more advanced than anything we could have imagined during my time in service." Harrison relaxed slightly. At least this one seemed to understand that times had changed. "I served as a naval aviator from 1965 to 1971, Garrett continued. "Like many of you, I was young and thought I knew everything about military strategy and combat operations. I learned very quickly that real warfare is nothing like what you study in textbooks or simulate in training exercises." The old man paused, scanning the audience with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Harrison noticed that despite his age, Garrett's presence commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with rank or ceremony. "During my 6 years of active duty, I flew reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam and Laos. The official records show that I completed 87 combat sorties, but the nature of some of those missions remains classified even today. What I can tell you is that every mission taught me something new about the unpredictability of war and the importance of adapting to circumstances that no amount of planning could anticipate." Harrison shifted in his seat, already formulating his polite but dismissive response to what he assumed would be another tale of antiquated aerial combat. The admiral prided himself on his knowledge of military history and was confident that most Vietnam-era stories had been thoroughly documented and often exaggerated over the years. I want to share with you today not just the excitement of flying combat missions, but the reality of making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information, unreliable equipment, and enemy forces that didn't follow conventional tactical doctrine, Garrett said. These experiences shaped not only my understanding of warfare but also my appreciation for the young men and women who serve today in circumstances that are often far more complex than anything we faced. The veteran's humble approach and acknowledgement of modern military challenges surprised Harrison. Most old-timers spent their time criticizing changes in military culture or claiming that today's soldiers weren't as tough as their generation. Garrett seemed different, but Harrison remained skeptical about the substance of whatever story was coming next. The mission I want to tell you about took place in October 1968, during the height of the Vietnam conflict, Garrett continued. It was designated as a routine reconnaissance flight, but, as many of you know, there's no such thing as routine when you're flying over enemy territory. Harrison found himself listening despite his reservations. There was something about Garrett's delivery that differed from the typical veteran presentations. The old man spoke with quiet confidence rather than bravado, and his words carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what he was going to say. I was flying an RF-8 Crusader, a reconnaissance variant of the Navy's primary fighter aircraft at the time. My mission was to photograph suspected enemy supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in eastern Laos. Intelligence reports suggested increased activity in the area, and our command needed visual confirmation of enemy movements and supply caches. Garrett described the technical aspects of the mission with precision, detailing the aircraft's capabilities, the photographic equipment used, and the specific intelligence requirements. Harrison had to admit that the veteran's knowledge seemed genuine and accurate, not the vague generalities he often heard from attention-seeking storytellers. The flight plan called for me to approach the target area from the east, conduct a series of photographic runs at different altitudes, and return to base aboard the USS Hancock, which was operating in the Gulf of Tonkin at the time. Weather conditions were marginal, with broken cloud cover that would make navigation challenging but provide some concealment from enemy observers. The admiral found himself drawn into the technical details despite his skepticism. Garrett's description matched his own knowledge of Vietnam-era naval aviation operations, and the veteran's matter-of-fact delivery suggested he wasn't embellishing for dramatic effect. What made this mission unusual wasn't the destination or the objectives, but what happened when I reached the target area, Garrett said. As I began my first photographic run, I observed something that wasn't supposed to be there according to our intelligence reports. Harrison leaned forward slightly, curious despite himself about where this story was heading. The veteran had established credibility with his technical knowledge, and his understated approach suggested he might have something genuinely interesting to share. Below me, partially concealed by jungle canopy, I could see what appeared to be a major enemy installation. Not just a supply cache or temporary camp, but a permanent facility with multiple buildings, vehicle parks, and clear signs of ongoing construction. This wasn't marked on any of our maps, and there had been no intelligence reports about enemy activity of this magnitude in the area. The audience was now completely quiet, absorbed in Garrett's narrative. Even Harrison found himself engaged, though he remained skeptical about the significance of whatever the veteran had supposedly discovered. I knew immediately that this intelligence was crucial, but I also realized I was in serious danger. If the enemy had established a major installation in this location, they would have anti-aircraft defenses that could threaten any aircraft in the area. I had to make a decision: complete my original mission and report what I had seen, or risk everything to gather detailed intelligence about this unexpected discovery. Garrett paused again, and Harrison noticed that the veteran's hands, which had been steady throughout his presentation, showed the slightest tremor. It was a subtle sign that whatever story was coming next had left a lasting impact on the man telling it. I decided to alter my mission profile and conduct a more thorough reconnaissance of the installation. This meant flying lower, slower, and making multiple passes over heavily defended territory. It was exactly the kind of improvisation that goes against standard operating procedures, but sometimes the value of intelligence outweighs the risk of gathering it. Harrison found himself reconsidering his initial dismissal of the veteran's story. The decision-making process Garrett described reflected the kind of tactical judgment that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulated in training exercises. It was the sort of real-world military leadership that the Admiral respected, even if he had never faced such circumstances himself. As I began my low-level reconnaissance runs, the enemy response was immediate and intense. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from multiple positions around the installation, and I could see surface-to-air missile sites that had been expertly camouflaged. I realized I had stumbled onto something much more significant than a simple supply depot. The veteran's description of the enemy defenses and his aircraft's performance under fire demonstrated a level of technical knowledge and situational awareness that impressed even Harrison's critical evaluation. Garrett wasn't just telling a war story, he was providing a detailed after-action report that revealed sophisticated understanding of aerial combat operations. During my third photographic pass, my aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious enough to affect my plane's performance and fuel consumption. I had to make another critical decision: continue gathering intelligence despite the mechanical problems, or abort the mission and return to base with incomplete information. Harrison realized he was completely absorbed in Garrett's account despite his initial skepticism. The veteran's story contained the kind of strategic and tactical elements that the Admiral appreciated, combined with personal courage that commanded respect regardless of one's opinion about military heroics. I chose to complete the reconnaissance mission. The intelligence I was gathering could potentially save hundreds of American lives if it helped our forces locate and neutralize this enemy installation. Sometimes individual risk must be weighed against collective benefit, a principle I'm sure many of you understand from your own service experiences. The audience remained completely silent, hanging on every word of Garrett's presentation. Harrison noticed that even the younger students, who typically showed little interest in historical military accounts, were paying close attention to the veteran's story. The return flight to the carrier was challenging due to the damage my aircraft had sustained, but I managed to land safely and immediately reported my findings to intelligence officers. The photographs I had taken revealed that the enemy installation was far more sophisticated and strategically important than anyone had suspected. Garrett concluded the first part of his presentation by explaining how his reconnaissance mission had led to a significant intelligence breakthrough that influenced subsequent military operations in the region. He spoke modestly about his role in the discovery, emphasizing the teamwork required to analyze and act upon the information he had gathered. As the veteran stepped away from the podium for a brief intermission, Harrison found himself reassessing his initial judgment. Garrett's story contained elements that rang true: technical accuracy, tactical sophistication, and the kind of measured decision-making that characterized effective military leadership. The Admiral was beginning to wonder if there might be more to this veteran's background than his modest presentation suggested. During the break, Harrison approached Lieutenant Commander Mitchell and quietly requested that she look into Garrett's service record in more detail. Something about the veteran's story had captured his attention in a way that surprised him, and he wanted to understand more about the man who had just commanded the respect of an entire auditorium with such understated authority. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell returned to Admiral Harrison's side just as the ceremony resumed, carrying a tablet with preliminary information about Thomas Garrett's service record. What she had discovered in the brief intermission was both intriguing and puzzling. "Sir, I've pulled what I could from the accessible databases, but there are some unusual gaps in veteran Garrett's file," she whispered as they took their seats. His basic service record confirms his time in Vietnam and lists him as a reconnaissance pilot, but many of his mission details are heavily redacted or missing entirely. Harrison frowned. In his experience, incomplete military records usually indicated either clerical errors or classified operations that remain sensitive decades after the fact. While the first explanation was common, the second was rare and typically involved personnel who had participated in operations that the military preferred to keep quiet. "What specific information is available?" Harrison asked quietly. He served 6 years active duty as stated, flew 87 documented combat sorties, and received several commendations including a Distinguished Flying Cross and a Silver Star. "But, sir, the citations for those awards are completely redacted, and there are several months-long gaps in his deployment records that aren't explained." This information gave Harrison pause. The Distinguished Flying Cross and Silver Star were serious commendations that weren't awarded lightly. More intriguingly, the redacted citations and missing deployment records suggested that Garrett had been involved in operations that remained classified 45 years after the end of the Vietnam War. As Garrett returned to the podium to continue his presentation, Harrison found himself studying the veteran with new interest. The old man's modest demeanor and understated approach to storytelling suddenly seemed less like typical veteran humility and more like the careful discretion of someone who was accustomed to keeping sensitive information confidential. Before I continue with the next phase of this mission, Garrett began, I want to emphasize that everything I'm sharing with you today has been cleared through appropriate channels and represents only information that can be discussed publicly. Some aspects of my service remain classified, and I respect those restrictions even in retirement. The veteran's acknowledgement of classification restrictions confirmed Harrison's growing suspicion that there was much more to Garrett's background than his initial presentation had revealed. Professional military officers who had handled truly sensitive operations rarely spoke about them at all, even decades later. After landing back aboard the Hancock and debriefing with intelligence officers, I learned that my reconnaissance photographs had revealed something extraordinary. The enemy installation I had discovered was not just a supply depot, but a major command and control center that coordinated North Vietnamese operations across a significant portion of the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. Garrett's description of the intelligence analysis process demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how reconnaissance information was processed and disseminated. Harrison recognized the terminology and procedures the veteran described as accurate for Vietnam-era operations, lending credibility to his account. Within 24 hours of my mission, analysts had identified key personnel at the installation, mapped its defensive capabilities, and begun planning operations to neutralize the strategic target. However, the location and defensive strength of the facility meant that any direct attack would be extremely costly and might not succeed. The veteran explained how military planners had struggled with the challenge of destroying a heavily defended target in difficult terrain without suffering unacceptable casualties. This kind of operational planning was exactly the sort of strategic thinking that Harrison appreciated, and Garrett's description of the decision-making process revealed deep understanding of military strategy. After several days of planning, the decision was made to conduct a joint operation involving Navy and Air Force assets. The mission would require precise timing, sophisticated coordination, and personnel willing to accept significant risk to ensure success. Harrison noticed that Garrett's presentation had shifted subtly. Where the veteran had previously spoken about his individual experiences, he was now describing large-scale military operations that involved multiple services and high-level strategic planning. This suggested that Garrett had been involved in operations far more significant than routine reconnaissance missions. I was selected to participate in this joint operation, but in a capacity that differed significantly from my previous reconnaissance work. Instead of simply gathering intelligence, I would be directly supporting combat operations in a role that required specialized training and clearances that I hadn't previously possessed. The admission that Garrett had received additional training and clearances reinforced Harrison's suspicion that the veteran had been involved in classified operations. In the military bureaucracy, special clearances and training weren't provided casually, especially during wartime when resources were scarce and operational security was paramount. The training process took place over several weeks at a facility that I cannot identify even today. What I can tell you is that it involved learning techniques and procedures that went far beyond conventional naval aviation training. We were being prepared for missions that required capabilities not found in standard flight manuals. Garrett's careful phrasing about the training location and content suggested he was still bound by security restrictions that prevented him from providing specific details. Harrison had seen similar discretion from officers who had been involved in special operations or intelligence activities that remained sensitive. The specialized training focused on low-level navigation in hostile territory, communications procedures that differed from standard protocols, and survival techniques that assumed we would be operating without conventional support systems. We were also briefed on enemy capabilities and tactics that weren't widely known to regular combat units. The Admiral found himself increasingly intrigued by Garrett's description of specialized training that sounded like preparation for deep penetration reconnaissance or special operations missions. Such activities had been conducted during Vietnam but were rarely discussed openly due to their sensitive nature. After completing the training, I was assigned to a unit that operated under different command structures and reporting procedures than normal Navy squadrons. Our missions were planned and authorized at higher levels than typical combat operations, and our results were reported through channels that bypassed normal intelligence networks. Harrison recognized the organizational structure Garrett was describing. Special operations units during Vietnam had indeed operated outside normal military hierarchies, reporting directly to high-level commanders and intelligence agencies. The veterans' knowledge of such arrangements suggested genuine involvement rather than second-hand information. The first mission with my new unit took place in November 1968, approximately 3 weeks after my original reconnaissance flight that had identified the enemy command center. Our objective was to conduct detailed intelligence gathering that would support a major operation plan for the following month. Garrett explained that this mission had involved flying at extremely low altitudes over heavily defended territory, using navigation techniques that required split-second timing and precise coordination with ground-based intelligence assets. The level of complexity he described impressed Harrison, who understood how difficult such operations would have been with 1960s technology. During this mission, I was operating under a call sign that differed from my normal squadron designation. For reasons of operational security, personnel involved in these special missions were assigned call signs that couldn't be traced back to their regular units or previous service records. The mention of special call signs caught Harrison's attention. He knew that sensitive military operations often employed such security measures to protect personnel and maintain operational secrecy. The fact that Garrett was discussing call signs at all suggested he was approaching information that might still be classified. My assigned call sign for these operations was Ghost 7, Garrett said quietly. The designation reflected both our unit's mission profile and the nature of the operations we conducted. We were supposed to gather critical intelligence while remaining invisible to enemy forces and maintaining complete deniability if operations went wrong. Harrison felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of Ghost 7. While he couldn't immediately place the reference, something about that call sign triggered a memory that he couldn't quite grasp. It sounded familiar in a way that suggested historical significance beyond just this veteran's personal story. The Ghost 7 missions involved flying reconnaissance sorties that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with available aircraft and equipment. We operated in areas that were considered too dangerous for regular units, gathering intelligence that was essential for major strategic operations. Garrett's description of the Ghost 7 missions revealed a level of risk and sophistication that went far beyond normal military operations. The veteran spoke about navigating through enemy air defenses, conducting surveillance of heavily guarded installations, and gathering intelligence that influenced high-level strategic decisions. One of our most significant missions took place in December 1968, when we were tasked with providing real-time intelligence support for a major operation that would impact the entire course of the war in our area of operations. The mission required us to maintain surveillance over enemy positions for an extended period while coordinating with multiple friendly units. The veteran explained how the December mission had involved flying repeated sorties over enemy territory, maintaining continuous surveillance while avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated enemy air defenses. The technical challenges he described demonstrated both the limitations of 1960s aviation technology and the skill required to overcome those limitations. During this extended mission, we encountered enemy resistance that exceeded all intelligence estimates. The enemy had positioned advanced surface-to-air missile systems in the area that were more sophisticated than anything we had previously encountered. Several aircraft from other units were shot down, and we lost communication with our command structure for several hours. Garrett's description of the enemy resistance and the loss of command communication created a picture of combat operations that had gone seriously wrong. Harrison understood how such situations tested military leadership and required individual initiative that couldn't be taught in training exercises. Despite the breakdown in communications and the increased enemy resistance, we continued our mission because the intelligence we were gathering was critical for ongoing friendly operations. We had to make independent decisions about mission continuation while operating in increasingly dangerous conditions. The veteran's account of independent decision-making under extreme pressure impressed Harrison, who understood that such situations revealed true military leadership. The ability to continue effective operations despite communication failures and unexpected enemy resistance was the mark of exceptional military professionals. The intelligence we gathered during this extended mission provided crucial information about enemy capabilities and intentions that significantly influenced subsequent military operations. However, the cost of obtaining this intelligence was higher than anyone had anticipated when the mission was originally planned. Garrett paused, and Harrison noticed that the veteran's composure showed subtle signs of strain. The old man's hands gripped the podium slightly tighter, and his voice carried an undertone that suggested the next part of his story involved events that continued to affect him decades later. On December 23, 1968, during what was supposed to be our final surveillance mission before returning to normal operations, we encountered a situation that tested everything we had learned about survival, military duty, and the cost of intelligence gathering in wartime conditions. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in Garrett's presentation. Harrison found himself leaning forward, eager to hear the conclusion of a story that had evolved from a simple reconnaissance account into something far more complex and significant. What happened on that December mission would become the defining experience of my military career and would remain classified at the highest levels for more than 30 years. Even today, there are aspects of that mission that I cannot discuss publicly, but what I can share will give you some understanding of the realities of military service in situations that go far beyond anything you can prepare for in training. Harrison realized he was completely invested in Garrett's story despite his initial skepticism. The veteran had demonstrated knowledge, experience, and credibility that commanded respect, and the mention of operations that remained classified decades later suggested involvement in military history that few people were qualified to discuss. As Tom Garrett prepared to continue his presentation, Admiral Harrison found himself experiencing an unexpected sense of anticipation mixed with growing unease. The mention of Ghost 7 continued to echo in his mind, triggering fragmented memories that he couldn't quite piece together. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell had been quietly working on her tablet, searching military databases for any reference to the call sign that Garrett had mentioned. "Sir," Mitchell whispered urgently, "I found something about Ghost 7. It's not in the regular databases, but there are references in some declassified intelligence summaries from the 1990s. Apparently, Ghost 7 was involved in operations that were so classified that even their existence wasn't acknowledged until decades after the war ended." Harrison felt his skepticism completely evaporate, replaced by genuine concern about what Garrett might reveal next. If the veteran had indeed been involved in operations that remained sensitive 30 years after declassification, then his modest presentation style was masking a military background of extraordinary significance. The mission on December 23, 1968, began like many others we had conducted as part of the Ghost 7 operations, Garrett continued. We were tasked with conducting surveillance of enemy movements in an area where intelligence reports suggested a major offensive was being planned. Our job was to gather real-time information that would allow friendly forces to respond effectively to enemy actions. The veteran's description of the pre-mission briefing revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that supported special operations during Vietnam. Garrett spoke knowledgeably about enemy order of battle, weather patterns that would affect aircraft performance, and the complex coordination required between air and ground assets. What made this mission different from our previous operations was the scope of the intelligence requirement and the duration of surveillance that would be needed. Instead of conducting a single reconnaissance flight, we were tasked with maintaining continuous observation of enemy positions for several days while remaining undetected by increasingly sophisticated enemy air defenses. Harrison understood the technical challenges that such an extended mission would have presented. Maintaining continuous surveillance required multiple aircraft, precise coordination, and the ability to operate in hostile territory without the usual support systems that protected conventional military operations. The first day of the mission proceeded according to plan. We successfully established surveillance of the target area and began gathering intelligence about enemy troop movements and equipment positioning. However, by the second day, it became clear that the enemy was aware of our presence and was actively attempting to locate and destroy our aircraft. Garrett explained how enemy anti-aircraft fire had become increasingly accurate and how surface-to-air missile launches had forced the Ghost 7 flights to constantly alter their flight patterns and altitudes. The tactical adaptations he described demonstrated both the sophistication of enemy defenses and the skill required to overcome them. On December 23, during what should have been a routine surveillance mission, my aircraft developed mechanical problems that forced me to fly at a lower altitude than planned. This put me directly in the engagement envelope of enemy weapons systems that had been positioned specifically to counter our operations. The veteran's description of mechanical failure during a combat mission resonated with Harrison's understanding of military aviation. Aircraft operating under combat stress frequently developed problems at the worst possible moments, requiring pilots to make life-or-death decisions with limited options and incomplete information. As I attempted to compensate for the mechanical problems and maintain my surveillance mission, I received a priority radio call from our command post. Intelligence analysts had detected signs of an immediate enemy offensive that would begin within hours. The information I was gathering was no longer just valuable, it had become critical for the survival of friendly forces in the area. Garrett's account of receiving urgent mission updates while dealing with aircraft problems illustrated the kind of pressure that combat personnel faced when individual mechanical difficulties intersected with larger strategic requirements. Harrison appreciated the complexity of the decision-making process that such situations demanded. Despite the mechanical problems with my aircraft, I made the decision to continue the surveillance mission because the intelligence requirements had become too important to abandon. This meant flying a damaged aircraft at low altitude over heavily defended enemy territory while maintaining precise navigation and communications with multiple friendly units. The veteran's decision to continue his mission despite mechanical problems demonstrated the kind of professional dedication that Harrison respected, regardless of his opinion about military heroics. It was the sort of calculated risk-taking that characterized effective military leadership in combat situations. For the next 4 hours, I maintained continuous surveillance of enemy positions while my aircraft's condition steadily deteriorated. The intelligence I was gathering confirmed that a major enemy offensive was indeed being prepared, and the timing and objectives of this offensive would catch friendly forces completely unprepared unless immediate action was taken. Garrett described how he had used his aircraft's reconnaissance equipment to document enemy troop concentrations, equipment positions, and movement patterns that revealed the scope and direction of the planned offensive. The technical details he provided demonstrated sophisticated understanding of intelligence gathering and analysis procedures. During the final hour of this surveillance mission, my aircraft was hit by enemy fire that caused significant damage to critical flight systems. I was forced to make an emergency decision about whether to attempt to return to base with incomplete intelligence or continue gathering information despite the increasing risk to my aircraft and my life. The veteran's description of being hit by enemy fire while conducting critical intelligence gathering presented exactly the kind of combat decision-making that couldn't be simulated in training exercises. Harrison understood that such moments revealed the true character of military professionals under extreme stress. I chose to continue the mission for another 30 minutes to gather additional intelligence that would complete the picture of enemy offensive preparations. This decision meant flying a severely damaged aircraft over enemy territory while being actively hunted by enemy forces that were determined to prevent the intelligence from reaching friendly units. Garrett explained how the additional 30 minutes of surveillance had provided crucial information about enemy reserve forces and supply arrangements that revealed the true scope of the planned offensive. However, the cost of gathering this intelligence had been severe damage to his aircraft that made return flight extremely dangerous. When I finally attempted to return to base, it became clear that my aircraft was too badly damaged to make it back to the carrier. I was forced to consider emergency landing options that included attempting to reach a friendly airfield in South Vietnam or ejecting over territory that might or might not be controlled by friendly forces. The veteran's description of his emergency flight back toward friendly territory demonstrated both the technical challenges of flying a damaged aircraft and the strategic thinking required to evaluate emergency options under combat stress. Harrison appreciated the complexity of the decisions that Garrett had been forced to make. As I flew south toward potential landing sites, I maintained radio contact with both my command post and friendly ground units that might be able to assist with recovery operations. However, the intelligence I had gathered was so time-sensitive that it needed to be transmitted immediately rather than waiting for my safe return. Garrett explained how he had used his aircraft's communication equipment to transmit critical intelligence about enemy offensive preparations while simultaneously dealing with multiple aircraft emergencies and navigation challenges. The multitasking requirements he described would have been extraordinary under any circumstances. The intelligence transmission took nearly 20 minutes to complete due to equipment damage and the need to encrypt sensitive information. During this transmission, I was flying a barely controllable aircraft over territory where enemy forces were actively searching for me while friendly forces were preparing to respond to the intelligence I was providing. The veteran's account of transmitting intelligence while dealing with aircraft emergencies illustrated the kind of mission completion under adverse conditions that characterized the most demanding military operations. Harrison found himself completely absorbed in the tactical and technical challenges that Garrett had faced. Just as I completed the intelligence transmission, my aircraft suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure that made continued flight impossible. I was forced to eject over territory that was contested between friendly and enemy forces, with no clear information about which side controlled the area where I would land. Garrett's description of the ejection sequence and his concerns about landing in contested territory created a vivid picture of the uncertainty and danger that characterized combat operations in Vietnam. The veteran spoke matter-of-factly about facing the possibility of capture or death while completing his mission. After ejecting from my aircraft, I parachuted into dense jungle in an area where both friendly and enemy forces were operating. I had minimal survival equipment, limited communication capabilities, and no certainty about whether rescue forces would be able to locate me before enemy units discovered my position. The veteran explained how his survival training had prepared him for some aspects of the situation he faced, but that the reality of being alone in hostile territory with critical intelligence about enemy operations created challenges that no training could fully address. For the next 18 hours, I evaded enemy search parties while attempting to establish communication with friendly forces that could coordinate a rescue operation. During this period, I could hear the sounds of the enemy offensive that my intelligence had predicted, and I knew that the information I had gathered was being used to save American lives. Garrett's description of his time on the ground demonstrated both survival skills and the psychological strength required to maintain effectiveness while isolated in enemy territory. Harrison understood that such experiences tested every aspect of military training and personal character. The rescue operation that eventually located me was itself a complex military operation involving multiple aircraft and ground units. The personnel involved in this rescue took significant risks to recover someone whose intelligence gathering had already served its purpose and whose continued survival was not essential for ongoing military operations. The veteran's humble acknowledgement of the risks that others had taken to rescue him reflected the kind of professional humility that Harrison had come to respect during Garrett's presentation. It was clear that the man understood the broader context of military operations and his place within them. When I was finally returned to my unit after the rescue operation, I learned that the intelligence I had gathered had been instrumental in defeating the enemy offensive and had potentially saved hundreds of American lives. However, the nature of the operations and the sensitivity of the intelligence meant that the mission would remain classified for decades. Garrett concluded this portion of his presentation by explaining how his debriefing had revealed the strategic impact of his intelligence gathering, but how security requirements had meant that his role in these events couldn't be acknowledged or discussed publicly for more than 30 years. As the veteran paused before beginning the final portion of his presentation, Admiral Harrison found himself completely re-evaluating his initial assessment of both the man and his story. The technical knowledge, strategic understanding, and professional humility that Garrett had demonstrated suggested involvement in military operations of genuine historical significance that deserved respect rather than skepticism. Admiral Harrison sat in stunned silence as the implications of what he had just heard began to sink in. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell leaned closer, her tablet displaying information that had taken her the entire presentation to compile from various classified databases that her security clearance allowed her to access. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I've been cross-referencing the dates and operations Mr. Garrett mentioned. The December 1968 offensive he helped expose was Operation Toontang. The intelligence he provided led to one of the most successful defensive operations of the entire war. Ghost 7's reconnaissance prevented what could have been a catastrophic defeat for Allied forces." Harrison felt his worldview shifting as the historical significance of Garrett's story became clear. Operation Toontang had been studied in military academies for decades as an example of how timely intelligence could turn potential disaster into strategic victory. He had taught classes on this very operation, never knowing that he might one day meet the man whose courage and skill had made that victory possible. As Tom Garrett approached the podium for the final portion of his presentation, the atmosphere in the assembly hall had changed dramatically. Word had somehow spread through the audience that they were listening to someone whose service had genuine historical significance, and the respectful attention had transformed into something approaching reverence. I want to conclude my remarks today by addressing something that I believe is crucial for current and future military leaders to understand, Garrett began. The missions I've described were successful not because of individual heroism, but because of the training, support, and institutional knowledge that the Navy provided to every person involved in these operations. The veteran's emphasis on institutional support rather than personal courage struck Harrison as exactly the kind of professional perspective that he valued. Despite having every right to claim credit for extraordinary achievement, Garrett was instead crediting the military system that had prepared him for his mission. The technical knowledge that allowed me to operate sophisticated reconnaissance equipment, the navigation training that enabled me to find targets in hostile territory, and the communication procedures that let me transmit critical intelligence were all products of military education and training programs that continue to this day in evolved forms. Garrett's acknowledgement of how military training had prepared him for his missions demonstrated understanding of how individual capability was built upon institutional knowledge. Harrison appreciated this perspective because it aligned with his own belief in the importance of systematic military education and professional development. Similarly, the rescue operation that recovered me from enemy territory was possible only because the Navy had developed procedures, equipment, and personnel specifically designed for such contingencies. The men who risked their lives to bring me home were acting not just on personal courage, but on training and doctrine that made such operations feasible. The veteran's recognition of how institutional capabilities had enabled both his mission success and his survival reinforced Harrison's growing respect for the man's professional judgment. Garrett clearly understood how individual military achievement was inseparable from collective military capability. What I learned during my years of service, and particularly during the classified operations I've partially described today, is that military effectiveness depends on the combination of individual initiative with institutional support. Neither element alone is sufficient for success in complex military operations. Harrison found himself nodding in agreement with Garrett's assessment of military effectiveness. The veteran's analysis reflected sophisticated understanding of how modern military forces functioned, and his conclusions aligned with the Admiral's own experience in military leadership and education. The technologies available to today's military personnel are vastly more advanced than anything we had during Vietnam, but the fundamental principles of military service remain unchanged. Success still requires careful preparation, sound decision-making under pressure, and the willingness to accept personal risk for collective benefit. Garrett's comparison between Vietnam-era and contemporary military capabilities impressed Harrison because it demonstrated that the veteran understood how military technology had evolved while recognizing the continuity of military professionalism across different generations of service members. I also want to emphasize that the classification restrictions that surrounded many of my missions were not arbitrary bureaucratic requirements, but necessary measures to protect both operational methods and the personnel who continued to use those methods after my service ended. The veteran's defense of security classification showed understanding of how military operations extended beyond individual service periods and how protecting operational information was essential for ongoing military effectiveness. Harrison respected this perspective because it demonstrated long-term thinking about military security requirements. The fact that I can discuss portions of my service today is the result of careful declassification processes that balanced historical transparency with ongoing security requirements. Many aspects of my service will remain classified indefinitely because they involve methods and capabilities that remain relevant to current military operations. Garrett's explanation of declassification procedures revealed familiarity with how sensitive military information was managed over time. His acceptance of continued classification restrictions showed the kind of professional discipline that Harrison expected from military personnel who had handled truly sensitive operations. As I conclude my remarks, I want to share one final thought about the relationship between past and present military service, Garrett said, scanning the audience with the same sharp attention that had characterized his entire presentation. Every generation of military personnel faces unique challenges that require both individual courage and collective capability to overcome. The veteran's emphasis on generational continuity in military service created a bridge between his Vietnam-era experiences and the contemporary challenges faced by current military personnel. Harrison appreciated this perspective because it validated both historical military achievement and current military capability. The young men and women serving today in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and other locations around the world are demonstrating the same combination of professional competence and personal courage that has characterized American military service throughout our nation's history. Garrett's acknowledgement of contemporary military operations and his comparison with historical service demonstrated that he understood how military challenges had evolved while maintaining respect for current military personnel. This perspective impressed Harrison because it avoided the generational criticism that many veterans expressed. The technologies they use and the specific challenges they face are different from what my generation encountered, but the fundamental requirements of military service remain the same: thorough preparation, sound judgment under pressure, and commitment to mission accomplishment regardless of personal cost. The veteran's analysis of continuity in military service requirements resonated with Harrison's own understanding of how military professionalism transcended technological and strategic changes. It was exactly the kind of institutional perspective that the Admiral valued in military education and leadership development. I hope that sharing portions of my service experience will help current and future military leaders understand that the challenges they face, while unique in their specific details, are part of a continuous tradition of American military excellence that extends back to the founding of our nation. As Garrett prepared to conclude his presentation, Admiral Harrison realized that his initial skepticism had been completely transformed into genuine admiration for both the man and his service record. The veteran had demonstrated knowledge, experience, and professional judgment that commanded respect from anyone who understood military operations and leadership. Before I close, I want to thank the Naval Academy for providing me with the opportunity to share these experiences with such a distinguished audience, Garrett said. It has been an honor to address current and future naval officers who will continue the tradition of excellence that has characterized American naval service throughout our nation's history. The veteran's gracious conclusion and his recognition of the Academy's role in military education reflected the same professional humility that had characterized his entire presentation. Harrison found himself applauding enthusiastically as Garrett stepped away from the podium. As the audience rose in sustained applause, Harrison approached the podium to offer his concluding remarks. However, his prepared comments about modern naval technology suddenly seemed inadequate after listening to Garrett's extraordinary account of military service under the most demanding conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, "we have just had the privilege of hearing from a naval officer whose service represents the finest traditions of American military excellence. Mr. Garrett's account of his experiences demonstrates how individual courage and institutional capability combine to achieve military success under the most challenging circumstances." The Admiral's public acknowledgement of Garrett's service represented a complete reversal from his initial skepticism about veteran war stories. Harrison had been forced to confront the fact that his assumptions about older military personnel had been both unfair and inaccurate. The operations that Mr. Garrett has described, within the limits of security classification, illustrate how timely intelligence gathering and sound tactical decision-making can influence the outcome of major military operations. His service during the Ghost 7 missions represents exactly the kind of professional excellence that this academy strives to develop in every naval officer. Harrison's endorsement of Garrett's service record reflected his growing understanding of how the veteran's modest presentation had masked military achievement of genuine historical significance. The Admiral was beginning to appreciate how professional humility could be a sign of authentic accomplishment rather than mediocrity. "I also want to emphasize Mr. Garrett's point about the continuity between past and present military service," Harrison continued. "While the technologies and specific challenges faced by today's naval officers differ from those encountered during Vietnam, the fundamental requirements of military leadership remain constant across all generations of service." The Admiral's acknowledgement of generational continuity in military service represented acceptance of Garrett's perspective on how historical military experience remained relevant to contemporary military challenges. Harrison had been forced to reconsider his own assumptions about the relationship between past and present military operations. As we conclude today's ceremony, I encourage all of you to reflect on Mr. Garrett's example of how thorough preparation, sound judgment, and commitment to mission accomplishment enable military personnel to succeed under the most demanding conditions. These principles are as relevant today as they were during the Vietnam War. Admiral Harrison's final comments represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of how historical military experience related to contemporary military education and leadership development. The veteran's presentation had forced him to acknowledge the continuing value of lessons learned during previous military conflicts. As the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, Harrison approached Tom Garrett personally to express his admiration for the veteran's service and his presentation. The conversation that followed would further transform the Admiral's understanding of both military history and his own role in military education. "Mr. Garrett," Harrison said, extending his hand, "I want to personally thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. Your presentation has given all of us a deeper understanding of the traditions of naval service that we strive to continue." The veteran accepted the Admiral's handshake with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire presentation. "Thank you, Admiral Harrison. I hope that my experiences can provide some useful perspective for current and future naval officers." Harrison realized that his encounter with Tom Garrett had taught him something important about military leadership, professional humility, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on superficial impressions. The call sign Ghost 7 would remain in his memory as a reminder of how extraordinary military service could be hidden behind the most modest presentations. The story of Admiral Harrison's encounter with Tom Garrett would itself become part of Naval Academy tradition, serving as a lesson about the importance of respecting military history and the veterans who had shaped that history through their service and sacrifice. It was a reminder that true military excellence often manifested itself through professional humility rather than self-promotion, and that the most important military lessons sometimes came from the most unexpected sources.